There are men whose very names make the underworld fall silent. Dominic Vale was one of them. They said his heart had gone cold long ago, cold as the stone walls of the estate where he had sealed himself away from the world. He had walked away from the game, yet no one in the shadows ever dared forget his name, until one rain-soaked night, when the bell at his gate rang out through the pouring dark. The man who had once brought the hardest men to their knees stepped outside and found something he had never seen in all the cold-blooded years of his life. A woman kneeling on the wet stone, her clothes torn, her trembling arms wrapped around a young woman fading slowly against her chest. Her eyes lifted to meet his, holding a terror so deep it seemed to have burned away everything else that remained. "Please, sir," she whispered, her voice breaking in the rain. "You are the last one. There is no one else who can save us." What the woman could not have known was that the one hunting her and her sister was the very ghost from the past Dominic had buried for years, and the moment he opened that gate, he was not merely letting in two strangers, but welcoming home a truth that could shatter every wall he had ever built. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel to walk with us through the healing stories still to come. In that first instant, the instinct that had been carved into Dominic Vale's flesh and blood over so many years surged to life, commanding his hand to tighten around the gate and force it shut. The world beyond it was something he had buried with his own hands, a land he had sworn never to set foot in again. He had paid far too high a price for the silence behind these walls, and no stranger, no matter how many tears she carried, had the right to demand that he open them once more. The woman at his feet was nothing but trouble, a streak of mud washed in from the noisy world he had abandoned without looking back. His reason passed its cold judgment. Her suffering was not his burden. He had seen countless desperate faces like hers in his lifetime, and he had learned that pity was a luxury a man like him couldn't afford to indulge. He was about to step back and let the rain swallow her pleas, but at that very moment, the young woman in Elena's arms began to tremble violently, her entire body convulsing like a bird with broken wings battered by a storm, then going limp, her head falling to one side as her breathing faded into faint, ragged gasps. Elena let out a wordless scream and clutched her sister tighter, her frantic hands brushing over Sophia's face as it slowly drained of color. It was that image, that fragile body slipping away in the freezing rain, that touched something inside Dominic's chest that he had believed was frozen forever. Something ancient and deeply buried beneath layer upon layer of time stirred awake. It wasn't compassion, he told himself. It was only the stark recognition that a life was dying at his gate, and that if he turned away, he would carry that death back into the silence with him, where it would gnaw at him through the long nights. He made his decision with the speed of a man reacting to the flash of a blade. The heavy gate swung open. His voice rang out, hoarse and decisive, cutting through the rain. "Bring them both inside, now." From the darkness of the courtyard, two powerfully built men emerged, momentarily stunned by the order, then bowed their heads and obeyed without a single question. They lifted the young woman with a strange gentleness for men so accustomed to violence, while Elena stumbled after them, her bare feet so numb that she could no longer feel the cold stone beneath them. Inside those walls lay an entirely different world. The luxury there wasn't ostentatious, but somber and oppressive, much like its owner. Long, seemingly endless corridors were paved with smoke-colored marble, while golden light spilled down just brightly enough to reveal the path ahead, leaving every corner buried in shadow. Dark paintings hung on the walls, along with framed photographs in which no one smiled. This wasn't a home, but a fortress disguised as one, with every window unusually thick and every door opening and closing in perfect silence, as though designed never to make an unnecessary sound. In discreet positions, silent men stood guard, their eyes following the two unfamiliar women, with the wariness of animals protecting their territory. The air inside the estate was dense with a mute kind of power, the sort that never needed to speak, and still made everyone hold their breath. As Elena walked through that place, she felt as though she had entered the lair of a sleeping beast, where a single breath taken out of rhythm might awaken something deadly. The man who commanded the household staff, a cold-faced figure named Marco, approached Dominic and lowered his voice until his words could be heard by no one else. "We don't know who they are, sir. We don't know who brought them here, and we don't know whether anyone followed them. Bringing strangers into the house now is no different from tearing open a breach with our own hands. Please reconsider." Dominic didn't turn around. His gaze remained fixed on Elena's thin figure as she disappeared down the corridor. "I already have," he replied, his voice so flat that the very lack of emotion in it was what made it frightening. "Call the doctor. One of ours. Someone we can trust. Tell him to come immediately. And don't let anyone else know." Marco started to say something more, but when he met his master's eyes, he swallowed the words and gave a small nod. In this world, Dominic Vale's commands weren't questioned. A short while later, an elderly man carrying a leather bag entered the room where they had laid the young woman down. His hands moved quickly as he examined her, his face tightening with concern. Elena stood pressed into a corner, her fingers clasped so tightly together that they had gone white, her eyes never leaving her sister for even a second. Dominic remained in the doorway, a silent shadow between light and darkness, watching everything. He wondered what he had allowed through that gate, and a faint instinct, cold and sharp as a blade resting lightly against the skin, warned him that tonight was only the beginning. The elderly doctor had barely placed his stethoscope against the woman's fragile chest when another attack seized her, more violent than the one before. Sophia's body suddenly arched off the bed, her pale gray lips parting in a desperate search for air she couldn't seem to hold, while her thin fingers clawed unconsciously at the blanket. Elena rushed forward with a sob breaking from her throat, but the doctor raised a hand to stop her, his urgent voice ordering more pillows to lift her higher. The tight clothing around her chest loosened, and someone to hold her still through the spasm. In the midst of that panic, Elena's hands trembled so badly that she couldn't manage even the simplest task, and just as she felt she was about to collapse, a tall figure stepped to the bedside. Dominic said nothing. He removed his outer coat, rolled up his sleeves, then, with a calmness that seemed to quiet the entire room, slid one arm beneath the young woman's back and lifted her, holding her upper body against the strength of his chest so her lungs could open more easily. His hands, the very hands so many people had once feared, now supported the fading head of a stranger with the tenderness of a father soothing a feverish child. He followed every instruction the doctor gave, precisely and without hesitation, wiping the sweat from her brow and gently rubbing her chest in rhythm, helping her racing heart find its way back to steadiness. Elena stood rooted in the center of the room, and in that moment, what left her stunned wasn't her sister's illness, something she had known far too well, but the sight of this man. She had heard Dominic Vale spoken of in trembling whispers and had imagined a cold-blooded monster incapable of feeling, yet now she was watching the very hands rumored to know nothing but death cradle her sister's life, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Something flickered beneath the ice that covered him, a trace of humanity he himself might have forgotten he still possessed. The crisis slowly began to pass as Sophia's breathing settled into a steadier rhythm, though it remained as fragile as a candle flame waiting to go out. The doctor released a breath of relief, wiped his forehead, then turned to speak quietly with Dominic. "This young woman's heart is weak by nature, sir," he said. "This isn't a new illness. It has followed her since birth. A heart like hers should have been kept in absolute peace, protected from every exertion, every chill, every fear. Yet one look at her feet and the state of her exhaustion is enough to understand that she has been running, enduring cold and terror for a distance far beyond what her body could bear. That is what brought her to the edge tonight. Had she arrived even a little later, I'm afraid there would have been nothing I could have done." From the corner of the room, Elena's voice rose, hoarse and broken, saying that she knew, that she understood exactly how weak her sister's heart was, that she had done everything she could to protect her, but they had been left with no choice except to flee, because what awaited them, if they stayed, was more terrifying than death itself. Dominic looked up at her when he heard those words, and his gaze remained on Elena's face a moment longer than it should have. Beneath the dim yellow light, with despair briefly receding enough to reveal her true features, something caused a strange, indistinct ache to pass through his chest, as though he had seen that face somewhere before, in another lifetime, in a memory buried so deeply that he could no longer give it a name. The sensation came and vanished in the space of a heartbeat, leaving behind a troubling trace of confusion that he quickly pushed aside. He wasn't a man who believed in vague impressions. He rose, gently lowered the young woman back onto the soft mattress, and drew the blanket over her, then instructed that the two women remain in the warm room for the night, and that someone bring Elena something hot to sustain her. Before leaving, he paused at the threshold. "You don't need to explain anything to me tonight," he said. His voice returned to its usual quiet depth, though some of the ice had left it. "Your sister needs rest, and so do you. Everything else can wait until morning." Then he closed the door behind him, leaving Elena alone beside her sister in the first silence that had felt safe after so many days of running. She bent down and pressed her forehead against Sophia's cold hand, and for the first time since crossing the stone gate, she allowed herself to cry softly, her tears no longer born of fear, but of the small flame of hope that had just begun to glow inside her. When the first rays of morning light filtered through the thick window panes, Elena was still sitting beside her sister's bed, and someone brought her a tray of hot food along with a message that the master wished to see her in the drawing room whenever she was ready. She found Dominic seated beside a large window, a cup of steaming coffee in his hand, his gaze fixed on the broad courtyard where the previous night's rain had left glittering pools of water. He motioned for her to sit in the chair across from him, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Only the soft crackle of the fire broke the silence. He was the first to speak, asking where she had come from and who had taught her to care for a weakened heart with such painstaking attention, because he had recognized in the way she had soothed her sister the night before the calm assurance of someone who had done it thousands of times. Elena lowered her eyes to the hands resting in her lap, and those hands told the story before her lips could begin. The skin calloused and cracked, the pale scars left by years of unending labor, the rough fingers of a woman who had never known a single day of ease. She told him that her mother had left this world when Elena was too young to remember her face, leaving behind only the faint memory of a lullaby in her mind. Her father, an honest but unfortunate man, had carried a debt that grew larger with each passing day until it crushed him, and when he died, that debt didn't die with him. It was laid entirely upon the 2 orphaned children he left behind. She spoke in an even voice, without bitterness and without tears, as though she were recounting the life of some distant stranger, and it was that very calmness that made the story more painful than any sob could have been. She went on to explain that from the time she was very young, she had been forced to become both hands and back in exchange for enough food to keep the 2 sisters alive, and that her childhood held no laughter or play, only one task after another from before dawn until late into the night. She had been taken into service in the household of a powerful man, and there she had learned a lesson she would carry for the rest of her life, that some people were born and treated as human beings, while others were regarded as property, tools to be ordered about, silent shadows whose existence wasn't important enough for anyone to remember. Through all those years, she said, she wasn't even certain that her masters had ever called her by the right name once. To them, she was simply the servant girl, a title used in place of a name, and she had bowed her head and accepted it. She had learned to make herself small and quiet so no one would notice she was there, because she understood that for people of her station, being forgotten could sometimes be a kind of mercy. When she reached that part of the story, she lifted her eyes to Dominic, and there was something in them that was both deeply weary and strangely unbreakable. She said she had endured all of it, had clenched her teeth and swallowed every humiliation, for one reason alone, so that her sister could live, so that Sophia could have medicine for her fragile heart, so that she could have a roof over her head, even if it was only a cramped corner in the servants' quarters. Sophia was everything that remained of Elena's family, the only reason she still believed her life held even the smallest measure of meaning, and she had promised herself that no matter what price she had to pay, she would never allow her sister to share the same fate of bowed submission that she had endured. Dominic listened to all of it in silence, and beneath the expressionless face he had worn for so long, a slow anger began to rise. It wasn't the kind of anger that erupted in flames, but the cold, deep fury of a man who had witnessed too many strong people crushing the weak beneath them. He had spent his entire life in a world where human beings were reduced to numbers, debts, and bargaining pieces, and he had believed himself hardened against stories like hers. Yet there was something in the way this woman spoke of her suffering without asking for pity, in the way she had placed all her love and hope into a life even more fragile than her own, that reached a part of him he had spent years trying to freeze. He looked once more at her calloused hands, then quietly asked what her name was, her true name, the one her former masters had never cared enough to remember. She looked up in surprise, because it had been so long since anyone had asked her that question, and when she softly answered that her name was Elena, he gave a slow nod, repeated it once as though engraving it into his memory, and told her that beneath this roof she would be called by her rightful name. The name he had repeated with such care seemed to give Elena a measure of courage she had never possessed before, and she understood that the time had come to reveal what she had kept hidden. The truth she knew might cause this man to cast her out beyond the stone gate at once. She sat straighter, clasping her hands tightly together, then quietly said that her arrival here hadn't been some accident of fate, that she hadn't simply run blindly through the rain and happened by chance to knock upon this particular gate. She had chosen him, she said. She had dragged her bleeding feet across mile after mile for the sole purpose of reaching this house, this man. Dominic set down his coffee, his gaze sharpening, and asked how someone like her had learned of his secluded refuge, a place even men within his own world spoke of with caution. Elena answered that in the servants' quarters, where powerless people like her were crowded together, stories still passed from mouth to mouth in whispers, and one name traveled through the darkness like a final glimmer of hope for those who had nowhere else to turn. People said there was only one man left in this world with enough power and enough courage to stand against the man who had imprisoned her life. Only one name, her master himself regarded with unease, and that name was Dominic Vale. She said she had clung to that story like a drowning woman clutching the last piece of wood within reach. And when every other path had closed, when no one on earth dared shelter the two sisters for fear of becoming entangled in their fate, she had wagered everything she had left on the fragile hope that the rumor was true. Dominic listened, his face retaining its customary calm, though questions had begun to gather rapidly within him. He wanted to know exactly who had driven her so completely to the edge, who could have forced a woman like her to risk even her sister's life in order to escape, and he asked the name of her former master. Elena hesitated, as though speaking the name alone might be enough to summon the man's shadow back to haunt her, and then she answered softly, her voice lowered almost to a breath, that the man who had treated her like a possession, who had declared that her body and her life belonged to him, who was even now sending men everywhere to drag the two sisters back, was Vittorio Salve. The moment that name fell into the stillness of the room, something passed across Dominic's face, the faintest pause, nearly impossible to detect, like a small ripple appearing on the surface of a perfectly calm lake before vanishing at once. The hand resting on the arm of his chair tightened for a single instant, the veins rising beneath the skin before sinking away again, and a cold gleam flashed in the depths of his eyes, though Elena, too intent on lowering her head to avoid his gaze, didn't see it. The name, Vittorio Salve, seemed to have touched some old wound buried far beneath the ice Dominic had spent years building around himself. A wound he had believed time had sealed long ago, yet he revealed nothing. When he spoke again, his voice remained as steady and quiet as ever, though it now carried a weight that hadn't been there before. He said only that he had heard the name, offering no explanation for why those few syllables had suddenly made the air in the room feel so heavy. Elena raised her eyes to him, and although she couldn't understand the source of it, she sensed that some connection existed between the man seated before her and the one who had destroyed her life, a connection far darker and more burdensome than Dominic was willing to admit. She felt as though she had unknowingly disturbed an underground current that had been flowing in silence for many years, something larger and deeper than her own tragedy. She feared the name might cause him to reconsider, might make him decide that she and Sophia were too great a burden and too dangerous to protect, so she hurried to add that if their presence placed him in danger, she was prepared to leave the moment Sophia was strong enough to travel. But Dominic only shook his head, his gaze turning toward the courtyard beyond the window where daylight was spreading across the grounds. And he said in a quiet but unwavering voice that she wasn't going anywhere, and that for as long as she remained beneath his roof, no one, not even Vittorio Salve, would be able to lay a hand on her or her sister. In that promise, Elena heard something far beyond ordinary pity, a certainty colored by a private hatred she couldn't yet begin to understand. The days that followed passed through a slow transformation no one knew how to name, and the strangest part was that Elena herself, the woman who had always been accustomed to shrinking into the shadows, was the one who brought that change. Once Sophia had grown strong enough to sit upright against the pillows, Elena found herself unable to remain still, because throughout her entire life those hands of hers had never known rest, and being sheltered beneath a roof without having to repay it through labor left her restless in a way she couldn't ignore. She began with small things, rearranging the wilted flowers in the crystal vase at the corner of the room, drawing back the heavy curtains so daylight could finally spill into corridors that had spent years buried in darkness, wiping away the thin veil of dust that covered the framed photographs where no one smiled. At first, the household staff watched her with caution, unaccustomed to the presence of a quiet woman moving softly through every part of the estate, but little by little they began to notice that wherever her hands had passed, the coldness seemed to lessen. The scent of her cooking soon drifted from the kitchen, the simple, comforting aroma of country dishes that this grand mansion had never known. And somehow, without anyone realizing exactly when it began, the men who had long grown accustomed to heavy silence started lingering at the table, speaking softly among themselves, as though they had suddenly remembered that they, too, were human. Dominic observed all of it from a distance with his usual quiet reserve, but something was taking place inside him that he didn't wish to admit, even to himself. He still kept his distance and continued to spend most of his time behind the closed doors of his study. Yet he noticed that he was stepping out more often, inventing vague reasons to pass through the places where he knew he might catch sight of Elena. He saw her sitting beside Sophia's bed, reading stories aloud in a voice so gentle that he would stop at the doorway and listen from the darkness without letting her know he was there. He watched the way she bent over each small detail of the house with patient care, and he suddenly realized that the place he had long regarded as a fortress built to imprison himself was slowly taking on another shape, warmer now, more like a home than a tomb. One afternoon, when he happened to enter the library and found Elena standing silently before the shelves, her calloused fingers moving lightly over the spines of the leather-bound books with a quiet longing, he asked whether she knew how to read. She turned with a start, a faint blush rising to her face in embarrassment, then answered softly that she knew a little, enough to read to Sophia, but that thick books like these were beyond the reach of someone like her. Dominic remained silent for a moment, then drew one from the shelf and placed it in her hands, telling her that she could read any book in the room whenever she wished, and that knowledge wasn't a possession reserved only for those born into comfort and privilege. Elena held the book against her chest as though he had just given her a treasure, and in the moment their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile understanding shared by two souls life had wounded in very different ways. Moments like those continued to gather quietly, so small and subtle that neither of them dared give them a name. There was the evening when the weather turned cold, and Dominic personally brought Elena a warmer coat, leaving it over the back of a chair before walking away in silence. There were the times Elena saved the best portion of the meal and carried it to his study, having realized that he was a man who often forgot even to care for himself. There were the brief conversations in the corridors that both of them tried to stretch a little longer, the silences that no longer felt heavy but had become strangely comfortable, the fleeting smiles they each hurried to conceal. The man feared by the entire underworld was slowly beginning to thaw beneath the steady tenderness of a woman who had never known what power meant. And that same woman, after years of doing nothing but bowing her head and enduring, was beginning for the first time in her life to lift her eyes and believe that she, too, deserved to be seen as a human being. Neither of them spoke a word about what was growing between them, but it was already there, fragile as the first ice of spring beginning to crack, promising that a new season was finding its way into a mansion that had once seemed destined to remain frozen forever. One evening, as Dominic passed Sophia's room and saw the young woman sunk into an exhausted sleep, her pale face resting against the white pillow like a flower about to fall from its stem, he stood motionless at the threshold for a long time, and in that moment the past he had buried for so many years rose up and swallowed him whole. The sight of that fragile young woman struggling for breath upon the bed tore open a door in his mind, a door leading back to the years he had tried to seal shut forever, and once again he found himself becoming the man he had been in another life, when he was still a rising force in the shadows, a man who believed power could purchase safety for those he loved. In those days, he hadn't been as alone as he was now. In those days, there had been a younger sister in his life, a young woman full of vitality and light, the only family he had left after their parents died, the one person he had loved and protected with all his heart. She had a laugh as clear as the ringing of bells and a gentle soul untouched by the dark world in which her brother had immersed himself, and Dominic had deceived himself into believing he could keep those two worlds separate forever, that no matter how deeply his own hands sank into filth, he could still shield her from every stain. He had built a peaceful life for her, placed her somewhere he believed was safer than anywhere else, and trusted that his name and power formed a fortress no one could breach. But he had been wrong, and the price of that mistake was the highest any human being could ever pay. The violent world he had built with his own hands, the world he believed he could control, had turned back and devoured the most precious thing in his life. On one fateful night that still haunted him even now, shadows from his struggle for power had come for him. Yet the one who suffered the consequences wasn't Dominic, the man who had sown so many debts of hatred, but his innocent sister, who had never harmed anyone. He had arrived too late, had only managed to gather her into his arms when life had almost left her. And in that final moment, when she looked at him not with blame but with a love so complete that it broke the heart, something inside Dominic shattered and never healed again. He understood then that his own hands, the very power he had pursued all his life, had become the blade that severed the life of the person he loved most. From that night forward, the man he had once been died, and from the ashes he walked away from the game, turning his back on everything that had built his empire. Not because he was afraid, but because he couldn't bear to see his hands stained with blood one more time. Yet withdrawing from criminal schemes didn't mean he had become weak, and that was the mistake made by those who didn't understand him. He had abandoned ambition and rejected every dark enterprise that had once brought him wealth and influence, but the iron principles that had forged him remained untouched. To him, betrayal was still a sin that couldn't be forgiven. A promise was still something that had to be kept at any cost, and the boundaries he drew were still lines no one was permitted to cross. The coldness that surrounded him wasn't the bloodlust of a brutal man, but the unyielding resolve of someone who understood far too well the price of mercy offered in the wrong place. He had learned that in the world he once inhabited, a single moment of hesitation could cost innocent lives, and he had sworn never again to let tenderness steal anything else from him. Now, as he stood watching Sophia sleep through her illness, watching Elena remain awake beside her sister with all the love and helplessness of a woman terrified of losing the person dearest to her, Dominic saw in them a reflection of himself and the sister he had lost so many years before. It was the same fragility, the same devotion, the same danger circling outside and waiting to take everything away, and within the heart he had believed had turned to stone. A new vow was quietly taking shape, that this time he wouldn't arrive too late, that this time he wouldn't allow the darkness to claim another innocent life, even if the price was his own. While affection quietly began to bloom throughout the mansion, Sophia, the quietest and most sensitive of the three, understood the limits of her own body more clearly than anyone else. After spending her entire life with a fragile heart, she had learned early how to listen to her body in a way healthy people could never understand, and she could feel that the candle of life within her chest was burning closer and closer to the end of its wick. She told no one, least of all her sister, because she knew Elena had sacrificed her youth, her dignity, and every chance of happiness in her own life simply to keep Sophia alive, and she couldn't bear to place another burden upon shoulders that were already bent beneath so much weight. Instead, Sophia chose to preserve the peace within her soul and pour all her hidden thoughts into another place. Whenever Elena was occupied in the kitchen, or speaking with Dominic in the library, Sophia quietly took out a small notebook she had asked one of the servants to bring her, and beside the sunlit window, she began to write. Her handwriting was careful but trembling, the handwriting of someone who had gathered every remaining ounce of strength for each word, and whenever she wrote, a strange serenity would settle over her face, as though she were releasing something heavy from her heart, or carefully arranging something for the people she loved. No one knew what she wrote, and she always hid the notebook the moment she heard footsteps approaching, guarding her secret as though it were the last precious thing in her life she still had the right to decide for herself. Then one afternoon, Elena entered the room carrying a cup of warm tea and found Sophia bent over the notebook. Her pen paused in the middle of a line, an expression on her face Elena had never seen before, sorrowful yet strangely tender. At the sound of her sister's footsteps, Sophia, startled, hurriedly closed the notebook and slipped it beneath the blanket, a faint blush rising to her cheeks like a child caught doing something in secret. Elena smiled, set the tea beside the bed, and teased her for becoming so mysterious lately, wondering what she could possibly be hiding from her sister. Sophia only smiled, her familiar smile clear and warm, and replied that they were merely scattered journal entries written by a bored young woman forced to spend all day in bed, nothing important enough for Elena to worry about. She added that writing down her thoughts made her feel better, made the long days seem less empty, and asked her sister to let her keep this one small piece of privacy. Elena didn't press her further, because she respected the little world that belonged only to Sophia, and she simply believed that writing was her sister's way of finding a measure of happiness during the confined months of illness. She sat on the edge of the bed and gently smoothed Sophia's hair, and for that moment the two sisters looked together through the window as evening light descended, savoring a peace they hadn't known for a very long time. Elena had no idea how much meaning the words inside that notebook would one day carry, that they weren't harmless pages from an ordinary journal, but the most precious things Sophia would leave behind for her. During those same days, the bond between Elena and Dominic deepened by another step neither of them could deny. One night, after the entire mansion had fallen asleep and Elena found herself unable to rest beneath the weight of the fears still pressing upon her heart, she quietly went down to the library and found Dominic awake, sitting alone by the window with moonlight spilling across his thoughtful face. He invited her to sit, And in the stillness of that darkened room, two people accustomed to concealing everything within themselves spoke with greater honesty than ever before. He told her, not everything, but enough for her to understand that he, too, had once lost someone he loved more than his own life, and that the solitude he had chosen wasn't born from hatred of others, but from fear that he might harm anyone who came too close to him. Elena listened, and for the first time she understood that this powerful man, feared throughout the underworld, was in truth as lonely and deeply wounded as she was. She placed her calloused hand over his in an instinctive gesture of comfort, and when he didn't pull away but quietly allowed it to remain there, they both understood that something between them had changed forever, that an invisible bond had been tied between them, stronger than any vow spoken aloud. The fragile peace the mansion had only just begun to build didn't last long, because one morning, while Dominic was reviewing reports from the network of informants he had quietly maintained even after withdrawing from his former life, he came across something that sent a cold chill down his spine. One of his most trusted messengers reported that rumors were spreading through the underworld. Rumors that Vittorio Salve was relentlessly tightening the circle in his search for the two sisters, and most alarming of all, his men seemed to be following a trail with unnerving precision, as though they knew exactly where they needed to look. Dominic sat motionless for a long time with the message before him, because he understood better than anyone that his refuge was one of the most closely guarded secrets in existence, a place whose location even the most powerful men in that world had never been able to uncover. The fact that Vittorio had begun to scent a path leading in this direction couldn't be dismissed as coincidence, and within Dominic's mind, the darkest and most difficult possibility began to take shape, that someone was passing information to the outside, from within the very walls he had believed were impossible to breach. He began watching in silence, revealing no sign of suspicion, because he knew that the moment a traitor sensed he was under scrutiny, he would retreat into himself and become harder to uncover than ever. Dominic reviewed every face in his memory, every person living and working beneath this roof, those who had followed him for years, and those who had joined more recently, searching for some weakness, some detail that didn't belong. He noticed conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered a room, eyes that turned away rather than meeting his, stretches of time when certain members of the household disappeared without any clear explanation. Yet all of it was too uncertain to point toward any one person. And that uncertainty was the most frightening part, because it left him no longer certain whom he could trust. Every person he had once considered loyal became a question, and every ordinary action now seemed stained with suspicion. The fortress that had once been his safest refuge suddenly became a maze crowded with doubtful shadows, and Dominic, a man accustomed to controlling everything within reach, Abalash felt for the first time in many years that the ground beneath him was beginning to shift. He summoned Marco, the man he trusted more than anyone among his closest followers, and quietly shared his suspicions. Marco listened with a grave expression, then admitted that he, too, had sensed something was wrong in recent days, that he had overheard fragments of hushed exchanges but hadn't yet been able to understand where they began or what they meant. He promised to investigate personally and discreetly, to watch every person in the house and follow even the smallest clue. And Dominic nodded, warning him to proceed with absolute caution, because once a traitor became afraid, he might act with a recklessness no one could predict. Yet even after placing the matter in Marco's hands, Dominic couldn't free himself from a vague unease, because he knew that in the world he had once inhabited, betrayal usually came from the place one least expected, from the very hands one had continued to hold in trust. He didn't dare speak of this fear to Elena, unwilling to destroy the small measure of peace she had only just found. But he began tightening the protection around the sisters' room, quietly building additional layers of unseen security around them. At night, when the entire mansion sank into darkness, he stood beside the window and looked out over the silent courtyard, knowing that somewhere beyond those walls Vittorio Salve was waiting, and somewhere very close, beneath this very roof, a traitor was silently counting down the days until the storm arrived. It was within that suffocating atmosphere of suspicion that Dominic decided the time had come to understand exactly why Vittorio Salve was so determined to hunt the two sisters to the very end, because throughout all his years in the underworld, he had learned that no powerful man would spend that much effort and that many resources merely to recapture a servant girl who had run away. Servants fled their masters every day, and men like Vittorio usually didn't bother to care, because to them, a powerless person was nothing more than something easily replaced. The fact that he had thrown all his strength into hunting Elena as though she posed a mortal threat, convinced Dominic that something far greater lay hidden behind everything that had happened, some secret Elena herself might be carrying without even realizing it. One evening, when the two of them were alone together in the library, he gently but directly asked whether there was anything she hadn't told him, anything that had happened during the final days before her escape, that had driven Vittorio into such a fury. At first, Elena avoided his eyes, her hands tightening around each other, and he knew at once that he had touched the very thing she had been trying to bury all this time. After a long and heavy silence, Elena finally spoke, her voice trembling as she admitted that she had hidden something from him, not because she didn't trust him, but because she feared it would draw him into a danger even greater than everything he had already endured because of her. She explained that during her final days in Vittorio's household, one night while she was quietly cleaning in the darkness, as she always did, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned never to be noticed, she had accidentally witnessed something she was never meant to see. She had seen Vittorio and his men carry out a terrible crime, an act so dark that, if exposed, it could destroy the entire empire he had spent years building, and even send him to prison for the rest of his life. Worse still, in the panic of trying to escape, she had unintentionally taken something with her, a tangible piece of evidence capable of proving everything she had witnessed, a deadly fragment Vittorio knew would keep both his freedom and his entire future hanging by a thread for as long as it remained in her possession. She said that this was the true reason he couldn't allow her to live, not the wounded pride of a master enraged that a servant had dared to flee, but the fact that she had become the one thing in the world capable of bringing him down. Dominic listened to every word with an expression that grew steadily more grave, and when Elena finished, he sat in silence for a long time, the scattered pieces of the story finally joining together into a complete picture in his mind. Now he understood why Vittorio had become so desperate, why he was willing to risk everything to find this woman. This was no longer the story of a powerful man trying to reclaim lost property, but a struggle for survival by someone attempting to silence the only voice that could expose his crimes. Elena looked at Dominic with eyes filled with fear and told him that this was why she had planned to leave as soon as Sophia was strong enough, because she didn't want to bring this death sentence down upon the man who had given them shelter, and she didn't want him forced to face such a dangerous enemy merely because he had shown kindness to her and her sister. But Dominic only shook his head, and in his eyes there was no longer only compassion, but the cold and unwavering fire of a man who had just found a reason to step back into the war he had abandoned. He told her to guard the evidence carefully, because it wasn't the curse she believed it to be, but perhaps the very weapon that would set her free, and in a low, certain voice, he told her that her war had now become his own. The heavy truth settled between them, filling the candle-lit library with a grim, suffocating silence. Dominic understood now that they were no longer just hiding a runaway servant, but harboring a lethal trigger capable of bringing down an entire empire. Vittorio Salve would undoubtedly burn the world to ashes to claw back that evidence, and with the shadow of a traitor already lengthening within his own walls, time was rapidly running out. In the tense days that followed, Dominic didn't merely accept her burden. He began to systematically reshape his entire fortress into a battle-ready cage. He doubled the guards at every threshold, reviewed the loyalty of every man on his payroll, and personally oversaw the security surrounding the sisters' quarters. Every shadow in the long, marble corridors now felt like a threat, and every hushed whisper among the staff was treated with cold suspicion. Yet, amidst this suffocating atmosphere of distrust, an unspoken sanctuary began to form between the former crime boss and the woman who had broken his solitude. The shared weight of this deadly secret drew them closer than any ordinary circumstance could. They found themselves spending the late hours of the night in the library, speaking in low, guarded tones by the fading embers of the fire. Elena no longer saw him as the heartless myth whispered about in the underworld, but as a protector carrying his own deep, invisible scars. Dominic, conversely, found his long frozen defenses thawing against her quiet resilience. It was the absolute calm before the ultimate storm, a period of intense preparation and quiet bonding where her war and his survival became so inextricably tangled that no force on earth could ever separate them again. In the days following that confession, there was no longer any distance left between Dominic and Elena that could keep them apart, and they shared long silences, in which they looked back together upon the lives each of them had endured. It was during one such evening, as they sat beside each other in the library, and Elena spoke of the old years beneath Vittorio's roof, that she happened to mention a terrible stormy night she had never been able to forget. The night when the entire servants' quarters had been awakened by violent sounds, and a chaos that still made her shudder whenever she remembered it. She told him that on that night, when she was still a small girl hiding in the shadows, she had seen a badly wounded stranger dragging himself through the rain, a man she had never met and whose identity she didn't know, only that his eyes held an agony far greater than the wounds upon his body. She said that a powerless child like her should have fled from danger, should have pretended not to see anything in order to preserve her own safety, but there had been something in the man's desperate bearing that wouldn't allow her to turn away. She had quietly shown him a hidden escape route known only to those who lived in the servants' quarters, concealed him from the eyes of the men searching for him, and pressed a little water and a strip of cloth into his hands to help stop the bleeding, all within a few brief moments before he disappeared into the darkness. She had never learned what became of that man, and throughout all the years since, she had continued to wonder whether he had survived that night. When Elena reached this part of the story, she noticed that Dominic had gone completely still, his face growing pale beneath the golden light, his eyes fixed upon her with an expression she had never seen before, astonishment mingled with something almost like pain. She stopped and asked in confusion whether something was wrong, and it took Dominic a long time before he could speak. He questioned her about that night, asking what she remembered of the place, the hour, and the smallest details, and every answer she gave struck like a hammer against a door of memory he had kept sealed for so many years. The stormy night Elena had just described, the night when a wounded stranger had stumbled through the rain in despair, was the very night that had taken everything from him, the night he lost his beloved sister and the man he had once been. He remembered with perfect clarity the feeling of being driven to the edge, wounded and relentlessly hunted, believing there was no escape left. And he remembered a small anonymous hand appearing from the darkness, a tiny figure whose face he hadn't been able to see clearly, showing him the path to survival and helping him hide from the men pursuing him. For all these years, he had wondered who had saved him that night. Many times, he had wanted to find that person and offer his gratitude, but he had never found an answer, and now that person was sitting directly before him, the very woman fate had once again brought to his gate on another night of rain. The faint sense of familiarity he had felt when he first looked into Elena's face now had an explanation, and the truth left them both silent beneath an emotion too deep to shape into words. Dominic realized that in the darkest moment of his life, when he had lost everything and believed there was nothing left for him to hold on to, it had been the selfless compassion of that small girl that saved his life, a simple act she had performed without expecting anything in return and without knowing whom she was saving. Now, after so many years, fate had given him the chance to repay that debt of kindness, to protect the very woman who had once protected him. He looked at Elena with eyes filled with tenderness and profound gratitude, and softly told her that she would never understand what her actions on that distant night had meant to him, that the small anonymous hand he had carried in his memory with gratitude all these years had belonged to the woman he now cherished above all others. Elena began to cry as the truth unfolded before her, and in that moment, two people whom life had broken in different ways, two destinies that had seemed like those of strangers but had in truth been bound together since a stormy night many years before, finally found in one another the meaning behind all the losses they had endured. The peace they had built through so much understanding and tenderness couldn't last, because one gray afternoon, Marco hurried to find Dominic with news that seemed to bring the entire mansion to a standstill. Their informants outside had reported that Vittorio Salve's men had discovered the exact location of this refuge, that they were no longer groping through the darkness but now knew precisely where they needed to go, and that could only mean the traitor hiding beneath this roof had completed his dark work and handed over the final secret Vittorio required. Dominic received the news with the cold composure of a man who had stood before countless storms, but inside him, every sense had drawn tight like a string on the verge of snapping. He understood that the moment he had always feared had finally arrived, that the confrontation he had tried to delay could no longer be avoided, and that Vittorio wouldn't come offering negotiations, but with the full force of a man determined to bring everything to an end. There was no longer time to search for the traitor, and no time left for hesitation. The only thing Dominic could do now was prepare, and above all, move the people he needed to protect somewhere. Vittorio's blood-stained hands could never reach them. His first concern, and the one that troubled him most deeply, was Sophia, the fragile young woman whose weakened heart couldn't endure even the slightest strain or fear, much less witness what was about to happen. He summoned Elena and told her in a voice that allowed no resistance that her sister had to leave immediately, that she had to be taken to a place of absolute safety, far from every danger, somewhere hidden so carefully that even Vittorio's most cunning men could never trace it. Dominic had prepared such a refuge long ago, a small house concealed in the distant countryside and guarded by the most loyal people he could trust, and he would personally place Sophia in their care. Elena was torn apart by the thought, because she had never spent even a single day away from her sister in all their lives, but she also understood that it was the only right thing to do, that keeping Sophia here would mean placing her already fragile life directly in the eye of the storm. When the time came to part, the sisters held each other tightly, and Sophia, although she sensed that something terrible was drawing near, still forced her familiar clear smile to reassure Elena, saying that she would rest obediently and wait for the day her sister came to bring her home, and that Elena shouldn't worry about her, but must take care of herself. Elena kissed her forehead, struggling to hold back her tears, and watched the car carrying Sophia disappear at the end of the road, until nothing remained but a vast emptiness inside her heart. Once Sophia had been taken to safety, Dominic turned to Elena and told her that it was time for her to leave as well, that he had prepared a separate escape route so she could take refuge with her sister, because the battle ahead was no place for her. But this time, the woman who had spent her life bowing her head in obedience lifted her face, looked directly into his eyes, and firmly shook her head. She said she wasn't going anywhere, that all her life she had been running, hiding in the shadows, and allowing others to decide her fate, and she was tired of living that way. She said that Dominic was facing this danger because of her, that the evidence she carried and the hatred he had never fully explained had placed him upon the boundary between life and death, and she couldn't abandon him to face it alone while she fled somewhere safe. She had come to him on that rainy night, begging for protection, and now that she understood everything, she wanted to stand beside him, not as someone weak who needed to be sheltered, but as a human being with the right to choose her own fate. Dominic looked at her for a long time, and in his eyes there was fear for her, but also a profound respect for the courage of this woman. He understood that he couldn't, and shouldn't, take away the right to stand upright as a human being, a right she had paid far too high a price to reclaim, and at last he gave a quiet nod. That night, as darkness descended heavily and the mansion sank into a frightening silence, the two of them stood together beside the great window, looking out into the vast darkness where the storm was silently approaching, and they knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The storm arrived in the deathly stillness of the deep night, when cars with their lights extinguished silently closed in on the mansion like a pack of predators surrounding their prey, and Dominic, a man who had spent his entire life reading the language of danger, sensed them before the first sound ever reached his ears. He hadn't remained still, and waited for fate to decide what would happen. Throughout that entire evening, he had quietly arranged his defenses with the cold precision of a commanding general, placing his men at every critical point, calculating each entrance, every exit, every blind corner, and every possibility the enemy might exploit. He ordered the most loyal among them to spread out and guard the approaches, building layers of protection that only someone familiar with every stone in the mansion could have devised. And he kept Elena close beside him, where he could watch over her safety. But at the most tense moment, when everyone had taken their position and the air had grown thick with anticipation, something unexpected happened that seemed to freeze the blood in Dominic's veins. Marco himself, the man Dominic had trusted above all others, the one he had charged with uncovering the traitor, suddenly drew his weapon and turned against him, choosing the side of the darkness pouring into the house. In that instant, every scattered piece fell cruelly into place, and Dominic understood that the betrayer he had spent so long searching for was the very man in whom he had placed his deepest trust, the man who had used that trust to guide death all the way to his door. The betrayal struck Dominic more painfully than any physical blow could have, because in the merciless world where he had once lived, he had learned that the deepest wounds always came from the hands we had once held in faith. But he didn't allow himself to falter for even a second, because he understood that calmness was now the sharpest weapon he possessed. While Marco was still savoring the triumph of his unexpected move, Dominic adapted at once, rebuilding the entire battle in his mind with the speed of a seasoned chess master. He knew Marco understood every defensive position Dominic had so carefully arranged, so he abandoned those plans immediately and shifted to a strategy even the traitor couldn't anticipate. He led Elena through dark corridors and hidden passages known only to him, turning the familiar mansion into a treacherous maze designed to slow the enemy's advance. Heavy footsteps thundered from every direction. The shadows of Vittorio's men poured in through every opening, and the confrontation erupted in the darkness, a battle unequal in numbers but favoring the man who controlled the board and knew the ground beneath it. Dominic directed those who remained loyal like pieces upon a chessboard, ordering them to retreat at times to draw the enemy into traps, then launching sudden counterattacks against weaknesses he had calculated in advance, and step by step, he seized hold of the early chaos and bent it to his will. In the middle of the struggle, the instincts of a true crime boss rose within Dominic more powerfully than ever, the authority that had slept for years beneath the surface of his secluded life, awakening fully in that moment between life and death. He moved along the edge of danger with a calmness that was almost terrifying, his eyes taking in everything, calculating every move, never allowing fear or rage to cloud his reason. For one brief moment, he faced Marco, and instead of unleashing his fury upon the man who had betrayed him, he only looked at him with a cold gaze filled with profound disappointment, and even Marco faltered before the commanding presence he had once believed he understood. Elena stayed close beside Dominic, her heart pounding violently in her chest, yet she forced herself to remain steady, and she watched the man she loved fight not like someone driven by bloodlust, but like a protector. Every action he took had a purpose. Every decision was made to end the battle as quickly as possible and preserve as many lives as he could. One by one, Vittorio's men were rendered powerless beneath Dominic's skillful command, and those who had believed they were coming to seize easy prey now realized they had entered the den of a lion whose claws were still fully intact. Yet even as the advantage slowly shifted in his favor, Dominic knew that the true enemy, the mastermind behind all this suffering, still hadn't revealed himself, and he understood that the battle that night wouldn't truly end until he stood face to face with Vittorio Salve himself, the ghost from his past he had waited so many years to confront. When the last of his men had been driven back, Vittorio Salve finally stepped leisurely into the center of the mansion's great hall, and his presence carried the arrogance of a man accustomed to regarding the entire world as his personal possession. He was impeccably groomed, with a falsely courteous smile, but beneath that polished exterior lay the cold and merciless eyes of a predator who had never known compassion. He surveyed the wreckage around him, looked upon his fallen men, then let his gaze settle on Elena, who stood just behind Dominic, and a contemptuous smile spread across his lips. He spoke in a voice that was sweet yet poisonous, saying that he had never imagined a lowly servant like her could cause so much trouble, that she had dared to run away, and had even dragged a man like Dominic Vale into the matter. But no matter how far she fled, even to the ends of the earth, she would always belong to him, would always remain nothing more than property whose value had already been set, and who had no right to decide her own fate. He ordered her to come to him obediently, as though she were still the silent shadow forced to bow beneath his roof all those years ago, and his voice carried the absolute confidence of a man who believed the fear he had planted in her for so long would once again bring her to her knees. But this time, the woman standing before him was no longer the trembling servant girl who knew only how to lower her head. To the astonishment of everyone present, Elena slowly stepped out from behind Dominic's protective figure, and instead of retreating in fear, she moved forward, lifting her head to face the man who had imprisoned the whole of her youth. Her legs trembled, and her heart pounded violently, but her eyes were as steady as steel hardened in fire. She reached inside her clothing and drew out the object she had guarded all this time, as though it were her own life. The evidence of the crime she had witnessed years before, the fragment of truth, powerful enough to sink Vittorio's entire empire, and she raised it high for him to see. In that instant, the arrogant smile on Vittorio's face froze, his eyes widening in horror as he recognized what rested in the hand of the woman he had always despised, and the air of invincible confidence surrounding him began to crack. Elena looked directly into the fear that had appeared in his eyes, and she began to speak, her voice soft at first, then growing clearer and stronger with every word, carrying into every corner of the silent hall. She said that for years he had looked upon her as an object, a figure recorded in a ledger of debts, a name unworthy of being remembered, and for so long she had believed him, had bowed her head and accepted that she had been born only to obey and be trampled upon. But now, she said, she understood the truth, that no one in this world, no matter how wealthy or powerful, had the right to place a price upon another human being and turn that person into property. She declared that she wasn't a debt for him to collect, wasn't an object for him to possess, and wasn't a nameless shadow he could discard whenever he pleased. She was a human being with a heart capable of love, with dignity that couldn't be bought or sold, and with the right to live a life of her own choosing. She said that he might have imprisoned her body for all those years, but he had never owned her soul and never would, and from that moment forward, she would never bow before him again. Those words, spoken by the woman he had always regarded as the least worthy of all, struck Vittorio Salve more forcefully than any fist or blade could have done. He had built his entire life upon the fear he sowed in others, had grown accustomed to seeing people bend and kneel at his feet, and now, as he watched the humblest servant he had ever despised stand upright and defy him while holding the power to destroy him, the twisted world he had worshipped for so long began to collapse. For one moment, he stood stunned, his face drained white with fury and terror, every calculation in his mind brought to a halt by the strength of a dignity he couldn't understand. And that moment of hesitation, the instant when his confidence was shaken down to its very foundation, became the fatal opening Dominic had been waiting for. Moving as swiftly as a shadow through the night, Dominic exploded into action, pouring all the strength and precision, honed through years of experience, into one decisive strike. He didn't move with the blind rage of a man consumed by revenge, but with the cold finality of someone bringing a threat to an end. And within a heartbeat, the man who had inflicted so much suffering upon innocent lives was brought down, stripped of every means of resistance, and left helpless at the feet of the two people he had believed he could so easily crush. The great hall fell into a sudden silence after the storm, and within that silence, Elena remained standing tall, the evidence still clenched in her hand, her breathing uneven but her eyes shining with a light that years of humiliation hadn't been able to extinguish, the light of a human being who had finally reclaimed her own dignity. Dominic stood beside her, looking down at the enemy fallen at their feet, and he knew that the moment he had waited for through so many years had finally come. Yet what remained in his heart wasn't the satisfaction of revenge, but a profound admiration for the woman who had taught both Vittorio and Dominic himself a lesson about the true strength of the human spirit. Dominic stood motionless, looking down at the enemy lying helpless at his feet, and in that moment an entire hidden storm surged within his chest, because this was the very man who had taken everything most precious from him years ago, the very ghost that had haunted his long, sleepless nights for so many years. Now, after carrying an unhealed wound and an endless burden of regret inside his heart for all that time, the chance to repay that blood debt had finally fallen within his grasp. One decisive act was all it would take, and the man responsible for the death of the innocent sister Dominic had loved more than his own life would cease to exist forever, and the call of vengeance thundered through him so powerfully that his hand began to tremble. Inside his mind, he heard the whisper of darkness, the same voice that had followed him throughout a lifetime in the underworld, telling him that this was justice, that this was exactly what a man like Vittorio deserved, that only death could erase the crimes he had committed and only blood could wash away a debt paid in blood. The temptation rose like a tide, pulling Dominic back toward the man he had tried to bury, the man who believed violence was the final answer to every injustice. And for one fragile moment, he stood wavering at the edge of that decision. But then he looked up and met Elena's eyes. There was no hatred in them, no hunger for blood, only a profound understanding and a gentle fear for the fate of his soul. Reflected in those eyes, Dominic saw the man he had become during the months that had passed, the man who had learned how to love and protect again, the man who had found a home and a new reason to live after so many years trapped in coldness. And he suddenly understood that if he ended Vittorio's life now, he wouldn't merely be taking the life of another man. He would lose the new self he had struggled so painfully to recover, dragging himself back into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. He thought of his departed sister, and he knew that with her pure and gentle soul, she would never have wanted her brother to stain his hands with more blood in her name, that what she would have wished for wasn't revenge, but for him to finally find peace within himself. He realized that killing Vittorio would bring only a fleeting satisfaction before fading away, leaving behind an emptiness even deeper than before and a new stain that could never be washed clean, while what the innocent people who had fallen truly needed wasn't another death, but justice, the truth brought into the light, and the guilty man forced to answer for his crimes before the world of human beings, rather than being quietly destroyed in the darkness like an animal. With that understanding, Dominic slowly loosened his clenched hand, and the rage roaring inside him gradually subsided, giving way to the firm calm of a man who had conquered the demon within himself. He bent down and looked directly into Vittorio's eyes. Vittorio was waiting for the final blow with an expression that held both terror and resignation, but Dominic spoke to him in a low, steady voice carrying a weight far more frightening than anger. He told him that he was mistaken if he believed Dominic would grant him an easy death, because death would be far too gentle a release for a man like him, an escape from everything he deserved to face. He told Vittorio that he would live, that he would stand before the law and answer for every crime he had committed, that he would watch the empire he had built from the blood and tears of countless people collapse into ruin, and that he would face the judgment of the society he had always believed himself above. Dominic declared that the evidence in Elena's hands would be brought into the light, that Vittorio's silenced victims would finally be given the voice and justice they deserved, and that his punishment wouldn't come from one man's fist, but from the justice of humanity itself. There was a strength in those words that Vittorio couldn't understand, because throughout his entire life, he had known only the kind of power built upon fear and violence, and now he stood before another form of power, one higher and more enduring, the power born from principle and integrity. Dominic ordered the men who remained to bind the defeated enemy, and he did so with calm finality, without triumph, and without needless mercy, only with the clear awareness of a man doing what was right. He had chosen not the easy path of revenge, but the far more difficult path of justice. And in that choice he proved that a person's true strength doesn't lie in the ability to destroy others, but in the ability to restrain oneself when every reason exists to let go, and that it doesn't lie in ruling through fear, but in preserving one's dignity and principles, even in the most violent storm. Elena stepped to his side and placed her hand upon his arm in a gesture filled with both comfort and pride, because she understood better than anyone the cost of the restraint he had just shown, understood how fiercely he had been forced to battle the ghost within himself in order to make that choice. The two of them stood together in the great hall, now silent after the storm, and in that moment they both felt that a dark chapter of their lives had finally come to an end, that the ghost of the past which had haunted them in different ways had been defeated not by violence, but by the strength of the human spirit and faith in something greater than hatred. When the storm had passed and peace had only just begun to return, it seemed that brighter days had finally opened before them, but fate struck Elena with the most painful blow she could ever be asked to endure. The moment she and Dominic hurried to the refuge to bring Sophia home, they received word that the young woman's fragile heart had grown dangerously weak, that the night of separation, and her unrelenting fear for her sister, had drained the last remaining strength from her delicate body. Elena rushed into the room where Sophia lay, and her heart seemed to shatter when she saw her there, her face pale, yet strangely touched by a peaceful smile, as though she had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. Elena collapsed to her knees beside the bed, seized her sister's cold hand, and called her name through her tears, begging her to keep fighting, begging her not to leave, because Elena had sacrificed everything and endured every humiliation life had placed upon her simply to reach this moment, when the two sisters might finally live together in peace. Sophia slowly opened her eyes, and her gaze was filled with a gentle love and a compassion far beyond her young years. She weakly lifted one hand and wiped the tears from her sister's face. She whispered that Elena shouldn't cry, that she had cried far too much throughout her life already, and that Sophia wasn't afraid or in pain. On the contrary, her heart was filled only with peace and gratitude, because she had been allowed to live, had been loved, and most importantly, had lived long enough to see her sister finally find a safe place where she could rest. Sophia motioned for Elena to bring her the small notebook she had always kept close, the notebook she had guarded for so long as a private secret, and placed it in her sister's hands, saying that this was what she wished to leave behind, the words she had never found the courage to speak while she still could. When Sophia released her final breath as gently as a flower falling from its stem in spring, leaving this world in the arms of the sister she loved most, with that peaceful smile still resting upon her lips, Elena held her tightly in unbearable grief. It was a long while before the first waves of sobbing began to subside, and only then did she open the pages her sister had left behind with trembling hands. Within those carefully written lines, Elena finally understood that the younger sister she had always thought innocent and in need of protection had seen far more deeply into everything than Elena had ever realized. Sophia wrote that she had known for some time that her heart wouldn't endure much longer, that she had felt the day drawing near, but what troubled her most wasn't the thought of her own death. It was the fear of what would happen to the sister who had sacrificed her entire life for her. She wrote that for so many years she had watched Elena bow her head and endure every indignity, had seen her surrender her youth, her happiness, and even her right to live as a human being simply to keep Sophia safe, and that this had become the greatest pain in her heart, more painful than the illness consuming her body day by day. In the letter, Sophia confessed that from the first days after arriving at the mansion, She had quietly watched and recognized what was beginning to grow between her sister and the man who had once seemed so cold. She had seen the way their eyes searched for one another, the way tenderness gradually warmed two hearts that suffering had frozen. She wrote that she had prayed for it every day, had quietly encouraged it in every small way she could, and had deliberately created moments for Elena and Dominic to spend more time together, because more than anything else, she wanted to know that when she was gone, her sister wouldn't be left alone and lost in the world, but would have someone beside her who truly loved her. She wrote that she could leave in peace because she knew she was leaving Elena in a place of safety, in the arms of a man who would treasure her as the precious person she had always deserved to be. She begged Elena never to blame herself, never to allow the pain of losing her sister to drown the rest of her life, but to live happily and open her heart to the love waiting for her, because that was Sophia's only wish for her. She ended the letter by saying that no matter how far away she went, she would always watch over Elena from somewhere beyond sight. And whenever Elena smiled with true happiness, Sophia's soul would find its greatest comfort and peace. Elena pressed the letter against her heart as tears streamed endlessly down her face. Yet strangely, in the midst of a loss that seemed beyond consolation, she also felt an immeasurably warm love surrounding her, the love her little sister had placed into every final word. She understood that Sophia hadn't left this life in despair or bitterness toward fate, but in the complete peace of a soul that had fulfilled its last wish, and that the greatest gift Elena could now offer her wasn't to remain forever lost in grief, but to continue living in a way worthy of the love Sophia had given her. Dominic quietly came to her side and said nothing. He simply wrapped his arms around her, allowing her to lean against his steady shoulder and cry until some of the pain within her had been released. And in his embrace, Elena found a place of refuge she had never dared to imagine throughout her entire life. Beyond the window, the first rays of a new day began to filter through the mist, falling across Sophia's peaceful face like a tender farewell. And both Elena and Dominic understood that although the young woman had departed from this world, her love and selfless sacrifice would remain forever within the hearts of those she left behind, becoming a warm flame that would guide them along the road ahead. In the days after Sophia was laid to rest, the mansion sank into a gentle solemnity, a silence no longer cold as it had once been, but warmed by shared grief and by wounds slowly beginning to heal together. Dominic had suffered more than a few injuries during the battles they had endured, wounds he would once have borne alone and in silence, just as he had borne everything throughout his life, but this time was different. One evening, when Elena found him sitting by himself beside the fire, the dark bruises still visible upon his body, she quietly brought a basin of warm water and clean bandages, then knelt beside him and tended each wound with hands that were both gentle and devoted. Something sacred and deeply moving unfolded in that moment, because it was the complete reversal of their first night in the rain, the night when he had been the one to bend down and protect the two sisters when they had nowhere else to go. Now, the woman who had once knelt before the cold stone gate and begged for help was caring for that powerful man with all her heart, and in her tenderness there was no longer any trace of benefactor and debtor, no distinction between master and servant, between the strong and the weak, only two equal human beings leaning upon each other as they healed from the wounds life had given them. Dominic looked down at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that years of ice hadn't been able to extinguish, and he gently took her calloused hand, the hand that had once saved him in the darkness so many years ago and was now warming his heart once more. They needed no elaborate vows or polished declarations of love, because what existed between them had quietly taken shape through everything they had endured together, deep and enduring as roots gripping the earth. In one another, they had found what both had spent their entire lives searching for in vain, a place where they belonged, a person they could trust, and a love that asked neither of them to bow their head or surrender their dignity. Elena, the woman the world had once treated as a nameless possession, had finally found someone who saw her as a whole human being and cherished her for the worth she had always carried. While Dominic, the man who had believed his heart had died with the losses of his past, had learned once again how to love and how to allow another person into the closed world within him. And through that journey of healing, they both came to understand a simple but profound truth, that no human being is a debt to be collected, a possession to be claimed, or a nameless shadow to be forgotten, and that every person, no matter how humble or privileged their birth, carries a dignity that can neither be bought nor taken away. They understood that compassion, the seemingly small act of one person daring to reach out to a stranger in a moment of suffering, was the greatest strength of all, because it didn't merely save the one who received it, but also redeemed the one who gave it, drawing both from the darkness of loneliness and hatred, and guiding them back toward the light of human kindness. When the dawn of a new day cast its warm rays across the mansion that had once been so cold and shadowed, the entire place seemed clothed in something new, and the stone walls that had been built to separate a man from the world were no longer a prison for a frozen heart, but a home sheltering a love that had only just begun to bloom. Dominic and Elena walked out together into the wide courtyard and stood side by side, watching the rising sun spread gold across the grounds. And although a long road still lay ahead of them, filled with uncertainties they couldn't yet foresee, and although the pain of losing Sophia still lingered quietly within them both, they knew they wouldn't have to walk that road alone. In their hearts, the image of the young woman with the clear and gentle smile would always remain, like an angel watching over them and blessing the happiness of those she had left behind. And it was her love and selfless sacrifice that had become the flame warming and lighting the path before them. Their story, which had begun on a dark and stormy night with the desperate ringing of a bell for help, finally came to rest beneath the radiant light of dawn, and it became the most beautiful proof that even within hearts turned to stone by suffering, love and compassion can always find their way home. If this story has touched your heart and left you with even the smallest lingering emotion, please give us a like, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so that each day we can continue listening together to more meaningful and deeply moving stories. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, so please don't hesitate to leave a few words in the comments and share the emotions that rose from the deepest place within your heart, because every message from you is a precious source of encouragement to us. Thank you for staying with us until the very final moment. We wish you and those you love abundant health, and may you find joy and peace in every passing day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the stories yet to come.